Okay, so part one, carving and shaping, just bringing out the components I need from specific shapes of stuff. This is a about 3-inch in diameter foam ball, and foam was not the easiest thing to work with, but it worked out in the end. You'll be able to see that by the end, but here I'm just carving out the shape for the kind of bulb at the top of the cane. It has several layers, it looks like, and then of course there's the white orb on top, but I didn't want to make that out of separate components, and I wanted the proportions to be just right, so I decided to make it all carved out of this one ball. And of course they have different widths and sizes, so I had to carve out each part kind of individually. Here I'm marking where I want the edge of one of the layers to end, and then after that I carve everything a bit more to be the smaller orb at the top. Now, as you can tell, the foam is really bumpy and messy when you carve it, but I fixed that in a moment. And then here I'm lining out the other edge of the layers, and so that part I'm working on now is the bottom half of the bulb. And here I took a simple nail file and I'm filing down the foam because I read that was an easy way to smooth foam out after it's been carved or cut, and that really did help. I did more filing off camera later, so you'll be able to see the final product later on. Here I'm continuing to work on the bottom half of the bulb, and as you'll be able to tell, I don't carve out the entirety of the bottom half. See, you can tell that the bottom half, the very bottom, wasn't really carved, and here I'm filing it, but that's because the bottom half appeared to have a bit more of an elongated shape, so I didn't want it to be perfectly spherical. You can tell right there. And then I filed it down just to make the transition between shapes and like carved versus not carved more organized. So here's what I call the gear housing. It's the part that the gears are in. I literally just carved this out of foam as well. That is a circle I made with Sharpie, about 3 inches in diameter, because my original measurement, when I drew it out, it looked really small. So then I carved this out from like just a rectangular prism shape of foam, and it was really annoying to carve this out and get this right. And originally the total, I guess, the depth you would call it, was way too fat. So as you'll see in a second, it looks a bit thinner, and also I did that so it'd be easier to carve out. Yeah, here you go, here's the finished thing, and then I filed down the sides, and the depth I just cut some bit off to make it less wide. This is the handle part. It's about 6.5 inches long, I think, and I just cut it from a long foam cylinder you can see in the background. And then here I'm filing off the edges that were cut, because you can tell they kind of have a tapered look on the cane itself, and I was going for accuracy pretty much. So I just filed down the edges to make kind of like a new side of the thing. You can tell what's going on in the picture, and then I filed the top because that's where I cut it off, so it was a bit of a messy cut. Here I'm taking the gear housing and the wooden dowel that I bought for the base, and I'm drawing a circle around it so I know where I have to carve, as I'm doing here with a kitchen knife. I need to carve the circle so I can stick the gear housing on the actual dowel to make the entire thing, because that was important. And since I was doing it out of foam, I just wanted to be able to like skewer all the pieces on and then like glue them in place, because I feel like that would be easier than doing something else. Now here I took a small plank of wood and I was measuring out the handle, or I don't know what you would call it. It looks like a trigger or a hand guard, but I just measured it out, and here I got a little handsaw and literally just like attached the thing to like my kitchen counter and just started to saw it away. Didn't get a lot of footage of that, but here's the cutout thing. I had to do some filing with the nail file to smooth it out, but it turned out alright in the end. And then here, there are 4 little nubbins near the top of the cane that look like little rectangles just glued onto the side, so that's what I'm carving out here, and these were made out of paper clay. They're just little like rectangular pieces, kind of shaped just based off the art. Okay, so here's part 2, the base painting. So basically a lot of the components on here are silver, so I had to use a lot of silver paint. I used silver acrylic paint, and this is actually the paint that I had when I made the little headpiece for when I cosplayed Weiss. her little crown thing that goes by her ponytail. So this is the top orb. I'm painting the bottom half of the orb silver, like it is of course, and using the acrylic paint was useful for kind of, I could fill in the blobs in the foam with paint to kind of smooth it out. And here are the two gears I selected. I was just painting them gold because that's pretty much what they look like. And then more silver paint here, and just painting more of the top orb with its different layers and components. And pretty much everything I painted in here got multiple coats because it's just best to protect it and to give it a better color. And I don't know, I used the paint to smooth out a lot of the little visible kind of dents that were made when cutting the foam. So it was really useful for that. And there I accidentally got some gold paint on the orb, so I had to wipe it off and paint over it. But, you know, just the daily grind. So here is the handle, or I guess the whole thing is kind of a handle. This is the main part where you actually grip it. Also, that's painted silver. And that was interesting to paint because it's like you're holding it, so you can't paint all of it at once. So you have to remember to go back and add more paint. And here's the gear housing. I know part of it isn't silver, but I decided to paint all of it, all of the base silver, just to get it over with. And here's the dowel from before, and I made a little mark where I wanted the bottom of the gear housing to be because the wooden dowel was a bit longer than I needed to be visible. So I just painted the top half silver because I thought like there might be little bits of it poking out between components that I was going to put on later. So just in case any of that was visible, I painted that silver so I wouldn't have to do that later. And then the rest of it I painted black because that's how it really is. And I know that it's actually kind of a square dowel that the cane is actually made out of, but originally when I went out to buy stuff, they only had circle ones, and I didn't have the time or money to like go search for a perfect square dowel. So this is just a 1-inch wooden dowel, and I painted it black because that's how it is in the show. And here I was finishing up painting the orb silver and the gear housing silver and doing multiple coats of that just to make sure it got a good color. And here I'm just, you can see me dabbing in the paint to try to smooth out the little holes made in the foam. And here's the cutout wooden handle, wooden trigger guard, whatever, painted that silver. So here's part 3, the assembly. Now, here I lost a bit of footage, which I was really mad about, but basically what happened is I drilled a hole the size of my second smaller dowel into the big dowel to insert it and give stability to the handle part. So here I put the gear casing, I was able to fit it on the dowel, and then I drilled a hole also through this foam handle to insert it onto the smaller wooden dowel, which you can see inserted into the big one here. We drilled a hole and glued it in, and it was a bit off center. You could see the hole in the handle that I just put on. It was a bit off center because the smaller wooden dowel was drilled in and it started off a bit off center. So I had to compensate for that. So the off center hole in the handle, it looks fine when you're looking at it because I made it in such a way where when you put it on the second smaller dowel, it was centered. So then once that was on and glued, I cut off the rest of the smaller wooden dowel that I didn't need so I would be able to skewer on the top orb. And then here I just carve out a little hole to be able to put the dowel, or to be able to put the orb on the second wooden dowel. Here's my drill. You can see it's pretty sparks. And then I just use that to kind of drill a hole through the foam to be able to put on the orb. It took me a few tries, and at some points it was lopsided, so I just had to keep working at it until eventually I got it to behave the way I wanted it to. So once the orb was able to fit on the way I wanted, I started attempting to hot glue it onto the dowel, but when I first put the hot glue into the hole in the orb, it didn't really work out, so then I put the hot glue onto the dowel itself and stuck the orb on that and just held it still for a little bit, and it stayed on. So then I hot glued the bottom part of it onto the dowel itself for more stability and to keep it on, obviously. And part 4, details and final assembly. So this is just the rest of the stuff that's not the main big shapes or colors. So here I painted the gears gold, and I mean you could see that they were painted gold earlier, but of course I had to rearrange the clips, so here I'm just painting the gears gold, and I gave them multiple coats for the best effect. Here I got out some more paper clay and I used it to create the rings around the different sections of the handle. There's a silver ring at the bottom and then 2 golds flanking the main grip part of the handle. So I got some paper clay and I made the ring shapes around about 3/4 of the way around the cane parts that they were sticking to, and because you can't hot glue them right away, so I just made them 3/4 around so they could hang there and dry and I could hot glue them later. So while those were working, I started sketching the design on the front of the gear housing. As you can see, there's the picture right there to the right, and I put the gears on there temporarily to make sure everything would fit and look pretty normal and not all like scrunched up. And then I painted in that shape with some bronze color, and when I brought it out, it was originally much lighter than I had thought, so I had to mix some paint later on. So once the paper clay had dried, I glued it on here just to, keep the rings on, because even if they're dry, they might fall off, and plus you want everything to be secure with cosplay props, so you don't have to deal with it messing up while you're on the show floor or at the con or anything like that. So once they were glued on, I let the glue just set and I continued to paint and add more details to the front of the gear housing. So those paper clay rings had dried, so I filled in the empty spots with smaller, like just little segments of paper clay to put them on, kind of stuck them on, and similar to the process of the other way, just I didn't have to go so far away around. And while those were drying a bit, I started doing the black outlining on the gear housing because it has some of that in the show, and just to give it a more cartoony but also put together look, I guess. I don't know how I would describe it, but I just did some outlining on the edges with black paint. I also did similar black outlining on the orb at the top to give it depth and shadow and detail. And then eventually the paper clay rings were completely dried, so I glued those on with hot glue as well. And as you can see right there, the bronze part where the gears go, it got darker. That's because I mixed the bronze paint with a little bit of black and made it darker for a more accurate look. So once the paper clay rings were dried even more, I started to paint them their respective colors. The bottom one, of course, is silver, and then the other 2 were gold. And then here I'm doing some more black outlining around the gear housing, and those were some sketch circles that are similar to whatever's on the front of the gear housing as well. Did some black outlining around the gold and silver rings, just to make them have a more polished and put together look. Yeah, here I'm drawing on the little circles of the gear housing. I guess they might be screws or something. And then here I took the handle and I sketched a square on the side of the gear housing where the handle would fit in, because I gotta fit it in to glue it in to make it the most secure. You can't just glue it on. And then I used my tools to carve out the square, and I kept testing the handle to make sure it would stick in enough but not too far. And then here I printed out a vector print of the handle design, or the grip design, and then I tacked it on with some colored tacks wrapped it around, and then I used a kind of X-Acto knife thing to carve in the design to the handle, because drawing it in was not going to happen for me. So it was actually pretty fun to carve this in. I forgot a little bit at first, but then I went back and finished it, so the design is complete. Took off the paper, and now you can see that there's the design on the handle. There are some holes that I filled in with paint, but before that I used just a normal ballpoint pen to kind of trace over the lines that I'd carved to give it a more visible look. So here I used silver paint to go over the lines that I had attempted to draw, because that was an immense failure, so I just cleaned those up, and then I also used the paint to fill in the holes that the tacks had made. And here I'm taking the 4 little nubbins that I made with paper clay once they were dried, and I was painting them silver just so I could get them on in silver before I glued them on to the actual thing. And here I'm gluing on the gears into the gear housing. And here is gluing on the 4 little nubbins, and they were kind of hard to fit on. I was worried they wouldn't stay, but I just used plenty of hot glue to make sure they would stay, and thank goodness hot glue is clear because it doesn't really obstruct any of the color, so I think they fit on pretty well. And there's the assembled things with the nubbins, and here is finally inserting and gluing in the trigger or hand guard. And that was the last thing in my process of building the cane. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and here you go.